Leslie Feinberg was an activist, writer, and speaker who was very active in the queer, trans, and working class liberation movements.
This was me 5 years ago.
Z defines transgender to include all people who cross the cultural boundaries of gender, and for Feinberg, this includes butch dykes and drag queens.
I had recently come out as trans, and I had received funding from my undergraduate university to create a podcast where I got to speak to a lot of incredible trans and queer artists and activists about their lives as trans and queer people. The conversations I had with people 5 years ago immensely influenced who I am today. This is an offering and an exploration of some clips from the Gender Blender podcast that I made 5 years ago, and some clips from the present day in 2022, as an exploration of the changing trans body and landscape.
Let's get back to Heather talking about her experience seeing Leslie Feinberg speak in DC.
Yeah, and I love their story. I mean, that story of trying different ways to be masculine was so my story at the time. And for a long time, I thought that that's who I was, but I was 15, 16, 17, something like that. And there was no sort of sense of using testosterone or transitioning in that way. It was always sort of like steroids, and I didn't want to go that route. So what I ended up doing is just really working on my fitness and trying to get as buff as I could and getting the shaved head and all that kind of stuff. And, I had lots of incidences where I was like getting pulled out of bathrooms, at train stations because people thought I was male. And there was a lot of anger and fear about just going to the bathroom. It felt super unsafe for me. And I started getting urinary tract infections because I couldn't go to the bathroom. It was horrible. And then it came to a point in my life, I guess in my 30s, where I started getting angry at feeling uncomfortable for not being able to go to the bathroom. I was like, you need to open up your idea of what a woman is, if I don't come in with long hair, does that mean I'm not allowed to use the bathroom? So then I started confronting people back. Then it became political, I think, at that point. As an older lesbian, I think that for me, saying that I'm queer means I do recognize the importance of sort of opening up the binary and not really having it's just this or that, black and white. For me, I think if I was younger and knew about the non-binary, and I would identify that way.
Gay clubs used to be our church, right? Now we don't feel at home in our churches no more.
Bars used to be the doulas of the trans community, and we're being increasingly deprived of spaces and ways in which we can birth ourselves as the people that we're supposed to be in this fucked up cis supremacist and white supremacist world. And we're being deprived of those spaces by wealthy cis gay and lesbian people, by wealthy white trans people who are conforming to the cis expectations of, nightlife and party culture.
As a person that is actually really a mixed race person, my father's Afro-Puerto Rican, my mother's Afro-Indigenous. I'm literally the remnant of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera herself, right?
Okay, it's trans history lesson time. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera should be legends in the LGBTQ community.
Marsha was a Black trans rights, gay rights, HIV/AIDS activist, sex worker, and trans woman.
Who was active in the New York scene throughout the 60s and 70s. Sylvia Rivera was also involved in the scene in New York at the same time.
She was of Venezuelan and Puerto Rican descent, and she was a trans rights and gay rights activist and trans woman.
Marsha and Sylvia were both involved in the historic Stonewall riots in Greenwich Village in 1969. At the time, the Stonewall Inn was one of the few places in the city where people who were queer, trans, homeless, and or racialized could commune. One night in June in 1969, during a pretty typical police raid of Stonewall, the patrons rebelled and fought back against the police, who eventually fled. That week, the first gay pride march occurred. Trans and queer folks were tired of being targeted by the police. And we should always remember that pride was started by trans women of color, like Marsha and Sylvia. Much like what TLC has been talking about, it's been taken over by mainly rich, cis, white gay men. I think in a lot of ways, TLC is trying to bring back a space of radicalism, a space where trans people, and especially trans people of color, can, to use Stephanie's words, birth themselves.
When I describe my gender to folks, a lot of people have like specific questions about my body or what's the end goal for me. And I've never thought of my gender as having an end goal. And that's not to take anything away from people who do. I just have, this is the way I do my gender. And so I often say that in 5 years, I don't know what I'm going to look like because I just don't know. I've identified as trans for probably 10 years now, and it's only been in the last 4, I think, in the last 4 that I've used, I guess you could say, medical transition. So I was no-op, no-ho, trans person. So trans to me is always the constant movement. It's always in transition.
Just like Ignacio said, I did not expect to be here 5 years later. I didn't know what my voice would sound like or what my body would look like, but the words that these people shared with me 5 years ago still live on in my body. I want to say a big thank you to the folks I featured in this episode, Heather Johnson, Stephanie Scora, Lasaya Wade, and Ignacio Rivera. And a shout out to Zakir Gowani, who made the music for this podcast 5 years ago.